Hi everyone. Welcome to the fourth installment of our equality unit here on Baden Hill. Now, I want to confess, there are times when I, as a talker, as a video presenter, feel very ill-equipped. I don't feel that I am the best person to present the information. Now, that probably is true for a lot of history because I did not experience it firsthand. But during this unit, I actually have experienced a lot of it firsthand. I saw it happening. But this installment of the Equality Unit is about movements for equality that are beyond my experience, more or less. And that is certainly true for our first portion. We're going to talk about the women's movement. And I am not a woman, and so I can't claim to understand everything that women have experienced in the world or in our country. And so with that disclaimer, I'm going to try and do my best. The women's movement goes way back in history. Definitely during the time of the American Revolution, there were already thinkers during the Enlightenment period who were looking forward to a day when men and women would be treated equally. That was their dream. During the French Revolution, the idea was to create equality between the sexes. People like Catherine the Great showed that a female could be just as much of an emperor or an empress as a male. And she was very much an Enlightenment thinker. She worked with Thomas Jefferson and Voltaire in France. And so Catherine the Great is an example of someone who was moving the women's movement forward. But really, it was the 1800s that led to a lot of the developments that we see finally today. And it began with people like Emmeline Pankhurst. She was an activist in the UK, and she developed the momentum that carried over into the 20th century regarding the women's movement. She saw the injustices that were happening in her society, and in the late 1800s, she was building a movement. It grew out of the efforts of people like Susan B. Anthony and other individuals who had tried to gain more rights for women, along with the abolition of slavery and rights for Black people and other people around the world. And so Emmeline Pankhurst maybe is the grandmother of the women's movement. She would be included in what was called first wave feminism. And so Emmeline Pankhurst and her whole family were involved in developing an awareness of what was going on. And sometimes they faced great resistance. They protested in ways that got them put into prison. And then when they were in prison, they were actually subjected to torture. And the torture that they faced was being force-fed, because what they did is when they got into prison, they went on hunger strikes. And so it was another form of protest. But the authorities actually got permission from the government to force feed them. And it was very painful. And that is something that we need to understand for any kind of prisoner, that just because someone is in jail doesn't mean they have given up all of their human rights. So Emmeline Pankhurst then moved to more dramatic and even radical or even violent means to achieve her goals. And her organization embraced arson and beating up policemen, that kind of thing. And so in some ways, we need to know that there were many different versions of the women's movement, and there was a lot of frustration. So that's the beginning, and it shows how difficult it is to make change happen. Another person we need to talk about is Alice Paul. And These are people that I have mentioned in previous videos, but those names may not be familiar. And if I repeat them, maybe they'll become more familiar. Alice Paul gets credit for really moving things forward at the turn of the century and then on up to World War I. And she did this by basically being a silent sentinel. And that was somebody who was basically protesting by standing in a very public, obvious place where she couldn't be ignored. And so a sentinel is a guard. And so she actually protested right at the White House, and she and others were arrested at times, but eventually she was able to talk to the president, President Wilson at that time, during World War I. And you know, he listened to her politely, but nothing seemed to change. Finally, there were movements during World War I because so many soldiers had gone away, the men had gone away to serve in the war. It was being more and more recognized that women needed to be recognized as a part of society, equal to men. And finally, at the end of World War I, Alice Paul and others were able to push forward the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave women the right to vote once it was ratified in 1920. Alice Paul then proposed the Equal Rights Amendment, and this is something that is still not an amendment to the Constitution today, but it was a movement. She proposed it in 1923, and it was almost passed. What happened was it took all the way until the 1970s. After Watergate, President Nixon resigned, President Ford took over, and then President Ford was defeated by President Carter. And part of the platform of the Democratic Party at that point was to push forward an equal rights amendment. President Kennedy had actually supported an equal rights amendment, but the problem was that many people in organized labor, the unions, they were worried that if this Equal Rights Amendment passed, that it would disrupt organized labor, and which was dominated by men. And so, because they wanted to protect their jobs, they lobbied the president and the administration to wait on an Equal Rights Amendment. So you can see that sometimes politics is really messy and even dirty. And even if a president or someone in government agrees with you, if they believe in something, they may compromise to make things move forward in a less satisfying way. Now, one person needs to get some credit here, and her name is Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan was a woman who, during the 1960s, she was looking around at the people she knew, specifically the graduates from Smith College, which she had attended, an all-women's college. And at the 15th anniversary reunion of their graduation, she was kind of commissioned to do a survey of graduates and find out how they were doing, how happy they were with their lives. And what she found, what she discovered, led to her writing a book called The Feminine Mystique. So in 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. And in 1964, it sold over 1 million copies. It was a massive bestseller. And clearly there was a hunger for more information about what women really thought. During the 1950s, women had basically been relegated to the house, the home, and their job was to take care of the home and cook and take care of the children. And this was kind of the 1950s Leave It to Beaver family. And the reality was that women were not satisfied with this kind of life. Betty Friedan was a psychology student, a psychology professional, and she actually studied people like Sigmund Freud, and she understood that Sigmund Freud's ideas had actually really done some damage. Freud basically believed that women would never change from being a certain biological creature and would be limited to their biological gender roles. And so Friedan basically is trying to disprove Freud's ideas and say that this is not what is necessary for a human being. Maslow was the name of a man who created a pyramid of needs for people. And at the bottom were the basic needs, safety and physical needs like satisfying your hunger and health and things like that. But at the top of the pyramid, built on those basic needs, were more abstract needs, the desire for self-achievement and self-actualization is what they call it. So I just wanted to introduce that a little bit to show you how she built her argument. She used very clear scholarship, very clear learning from the past, and then she showed the real reality for women. And so she actually created an organization in 1966 called the National Organization for Women. And it's kind of interesting. It was in her hotel room that organization came to be, and she actually wrote on a napkin what the acronym would be for this women's movement. And it's such a powerful one because it doesn't just talk about an association for women. It says it needs to happen now. And so the Equal Rights Amendment, which is ERA, another great acronym, which means a time period, basically goes together with the National Organization for Women, ERA Now. This became a rallying cry in the 1970s as there was another push during this second wave of feminism trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which would guarantee equal wages, equal treatment throughout society in America. Now, two other people that we should mention are Gloria Steinem, who was someone who was a journalist and also a feminist during this same period of time as Betty Friedan. And Gloria Steinem founded a magazine called Miss. And Ms., MS period, represented this women's movement, and it had articles in it about what women were really thinking and how women wanted to have the ability to have careers and be treated as equal partners with men. And so Gloria Steinem is a big part of this movement. There's another Gloria that we should know because it isn't just journalism and political organizations that create change. Gloria Allred is a lawyer who went to bat for numerous women in numerous situations, and she faced intense criticism from the men in her world and also women who were satisfied with conservative thinking and conservative roles and didn't believe that women should be taken out of the home. It's understandable that some women were uncomfortable with radical change because it would affect families dramatically. But Gloria Allred, she stood up and, for example, when there were restaurants or bars that would only serve men, and this was very common back, hundreds of years, to have men's clubs where only men could gather and talk about important events, politics, make business relationships and things like that. And so it wasn't just about a bar serving women. It was about women being allowed to participate in the political process. And so Gloria Allred fought many cases and forced bars and restaurants to admit anybody. And this was a breakthrough at the end of the 1960s into the 1970s. And again, in the 1970s, I do remember this movement, ERA Now. There's one more person we need to talk about. Sometimes we don't realize how much impact celebrities and sports figures can have on this political process. And we've already seen how Muhammad Ali could have an impact during the Vietnam War, standing up for his beliefs regarding what was right for him and, why he shouldn't have to serve in Vietnam. Another athlete, Billie Jean King, who was a woman. Okay, Billie is a man's name, obviously, but this was a woman who made a difference. She was a dynamic superstar in tennis, even though, honestly, women's tennis was nowhere near what men's tennis was during the 1960s, and the prizes that were being offered, the money was totally different. Men were receiving a lot more money for their efforts in tennis. And Billie Jean King was winning like crazy, but finally in 1972, she was at Wimbledon, and she said, look, my prize is $15,000 less than the men's winner, and so next year I'm not going to play, I'm not going to participate unless I am given the same prize money. And that was called the girl cot, and she used that word. She actually used another word called shamateurism. Amateurism is when you play a sport without getting paid, but the problem was that many superstars in the 1960s were getting money under the table to participate in tournaments. And so if amateurs weren't supposed to get paid, but you're still getting money under the table, that means illegally, without anybody else knowing, then it's shady, it's dirty. And so Billie Jean King fought against shamateurism, sham amateurism, and she also talked about the girl cot, not a boycott. During the 1968 Olympics, there were black athletes who were protesting, and many of them got into trouble because they were protesting treatment of African Americans in the United States. And the female black athletes actually said, wait, we're not going to girl cot because we haven't even been accepted at all within the Olympics. And so Billie Jean King was famous for this. And finally, in 1973, this kind of came to national attention. And what happened is Bobby Riggs, who had been the best tennis player in the world in the late 1940s, he was 55 years old now, clearly past his prime. He said, you know what? Even though I'm 55 years old, I'm a middle-aged man, I could beat any of the best women tennis players. Hands down, one hand tied behind my back, basically. And he actually did play a woman named Margaret Court, who had been a superstar in the 1960s, was a competitor with Billie Jean King, and he defeated Margaret Court easily. And so Billie Jean King kept refusing to accept his offer to play, and finally, basically, she wanted more money if she was going to risk her reputation, as Margaret Court had done. And finally, when the prize money went up to $100,000, she said, okay, I'll play you, Bobby Riggs. And so Bobby Riggs played Billie Jean King, and Bobby Riggs got his behind beat. And he was a part of one of the greatest moments. It was called the Battle of the Sexes, and it showed that women athletes should be respected. So that's a little bit about the women's movement. And what you should know is that the Equal Rights Amendment, even though there was all this momentum, 38 states were required to ratify the amendment, and only 35 roughly were able to ratify it. Others were concerned. There were divisions among the women's group, among the members of NOW. Some thought that passing the Equal Rights Amendment would negatively impact women because they would be drafted into the military. Remember, this is right after the Vietnam War, and so many women said, wait a minute, we're not trained, we're not ready to go into combat like men have been trained. And so the support started to decline, and even though President Carter was able to extend the deadline for ratification until 1982, President Reagan was elected in 1980, and he really didn't support the Equal Rights Amendment. And so it faded, and even though other states have tried to revive the Equal Rights Amendment since then, it has never been passed in our country. The assumption is that the language of the Constitution already protects women, but there's a clear discrepancy. There's a difference between how much money men make and how much money women make for the same jobs. All you have to do is look at Hollywood to see how much male stars are paid versus females in the same movie. So I hope this helps a little bit as you try to understand the women's movement. The next group that I'd like to talk about is a group of people that incredibly have become more and more invisible in our country. America was a land that belonged to Native Americans. Today, there are approximately 3 million Native Americans within the population of the United States, which is about 330 million. So you can do the math. Only about 1% of Americans are considered Native Americans. This is stunning because it essentially indicates that Native Americans have been exterminated, or they have blended in with the rest of the population. One thing that has happened over the history of the United States is a gradual pushing of Native Americans away from their own homes and away from their own lands. And we have discussed this at length. We've discussed the Trail of Tears, but we need to now talk about where Native Americans have ended up. Generally speaking, we call the lands of Native Americans in the United States reservations. So this word talks about land that is set aside for Native Americans to live on. Back during the time of the Trail of Tears, the Seminoles and Cherokees and so many other groups, they were moved to places like Oklahoma. But then, as land became scarce in the United States, even Oklahoma was opened up and Native Americans were moved to other places further west. The Dawes Act of 1887 is one of the hardest pieces of government legislation to stomach. It basically was designed to scatter Native Americans, to assimilate them into the general population. And we talk about the United States as being a melting pot, but in this case, Native American Indian reservations were being divided up and the land was being given to individuals and not always to Native American individuals. And so what this was creating was a fragmentation of tribal identity. So the Dawes Act is seen as one of the greatest attacks ever on Native Americans, splintering and disintegrating their tribes. Over time, the U.S. government changed its policies and started to protect reservations and tribal identities and tribal sovereignty. Sovereignty is when a group of people in a given area have control over their own destiny. Now, there is a limited sovereignty for Native Americans within the United States, meaning they don't get to do whatever they want within the United States, but on their own property, their laws are actually different from the laws of the area around them. So if you have a reservation in New Mexico, like the Navajo, the reservation will be able to decide for itself what it wants to do. And this is true even in California, where there are many small reservations. And today, those reservations do have limited sovereignty, and so they can decide what they want to do with their own group of people. During the 1960s and 1970s, there were all these movements to change things, whether it was civil rights for African Americans or gradually the women's movement and second wave feminism. Gradually, other people groups saw this as their opportunity, and Native Americans started gaining momentum and thinking about what they wanted their lives to be. You may remember that Wounded Knee was the location of a terrible massacre at the end of the Indian Wars in the 1800s, when the Lakota Sioux were trying to survive, and their leader, Sitting Bull, basically was forced to give up. Eventually, he became a participant in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. But after that, he went back to Wounded Knee. And so he was seen as a leader of Native Americans. And when the ghost dances started, when this spiritual movement that was uniting Native Americans began to get stronger, it was seen that Sitting Bull might be a potential leader for them. And so he was chased, and eventually during that chase, he was shot and killed. So that's how Sitting Bull died, as a part of that Wounded Knee massacre. Now, 100 years later, there was a second Wounded Knee, and this happened at the same location. Basically, the Oglala Sioux, who were connected to the Lakota Sioux, the Oglala Sioux had a leadership crisis, and it led to violence and the death of a U.S. Marshal, and then the deaths of a couple of Native American leaders who were at Wounded Knee. A group of Native Americans occupied the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and that led to a standoff. The Native Americans were a part of a movement called AIM, the American Indian Movement. And so AIM was supporting this group that had taken over Wounded Knee, but there were many people who saw this as a threat to the U.S. government. And fortunately, there was some restraint, and the U.S. government was able to work it out so that there was an end to that incident in Wounded Knee. But it was a reminder that many Native Americans were not happy with the way things were going and how reservations had some of the worst living conditions in the United States. There are generally higher rates of alcoholism and deaths because of alcohol-related traffic accidents. And so reservations have not been seen as opportunity for Native Americans. They've been seen as kinds of prisons. Now, during the 1980s, conditions on the reservations started to change, and it was because of an opportunity, because of their ability to decide for themselves what they wanted to do. It became clear that they could create gaming industries, meaning gambling. And it was something that wasn't against Native American culture. And so Native Americans started pushing for casinos to be built on Native American reservations. And there were celebrities that were involved in pushing this forward. A man named Kevin Costner, he was in an Academy Award-winning movie called Dances with Wolves. And he was the director and also the actor in the movie, and he got a lot of recognition. And he actually lived right down the street from me in Southern California. But Kevin Costner was promoting this gaming industry for Native Americans, especially in South Dakota, so that they could support themselves, so that there could be health care and housing provided for all people in that community, and so that people could get treatment for alcoholism, and so that education could improve. To do all of those things, you need money, and the gaming industry could provide money. Unfortunately, the gaming industry could also bring in organized crime. That was true in Las Vegas and other places like Atlantic City, where there were casinos and gambling industries. So, under President Reagan in 1988, there was an act passed. It was called the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, IGRA. It was passed in 1988. And what it did is it created more oversight by the federal government. So reservations, tribes could still create casinos, but there was some accountability to the federal government. Now, this may sound like more government meddling in the affairs of Native Americans, but it actually created a situation where reservations could get help from the federal government in case there was crime happening, and especially if people were coming from other places and bringing the crime with them. So because of that act being passed, the revenue from casinos on reservations, it went from $100 million in 1988 to almost $17 billion by 2006. And today, that number is almost double. So the amount of money we're talking about is $20 billion. And you can imagine how that kind of money could revitalize Native American communities. So casinos, we might say they're shady. It's not something we want. As Christians, we may have trouble with the idea of gambling and all the other things associated with gambling. But we do need to understand that these Native Americans have been treated terribly, and that having a say in their own destiny, that's something that maybe we can support. Now, one thing that happened, there was a scandal related to this involving a man named Jack Abramoff and other members of the government, and also people who are very influential in government. There are people who have been involved in making money illegally by basically bribing government officials in order to be a part of this gaming industry. And so that's the ugly side of Native American casinos and the gaming industry. We need to talk about two other situations. One is the Dakota Access Pipeline, which again is happening in South Dakota, and it's because there's a lot of oil that's produced in Alaska and in Canada, and to get the oil down to the refineries on the Gulf Coast, it takes pipelines. It takes a network of pipes to carry that oil. And in Dakota, in South Dakota, there has been a crisis for Native Americans because the pipeline basically is going through their land. And even though it goes under a lake, the potential for it to break open and pollute the lake, it's seen as an attack on Native American sensibilities. They don't want to pollute the land. And so there were many protests regarding that Dakota Access Pipeline. But under the current administration in the U.S. government, basically those Native Americans have lost the right to block that pipeline. In addition, Yucca Mountain in Nevada is a place where it was being considered by the U.S. government as a place to dump radioactive waste, which is the byproduct from nuclear energy. But you have radioactive waste, and radioactive waste can't just be thrown into the ocean or the trash. It needs to be buried in the ground, and it will take thousands of years before it basically is safe. And so Yucca Mountain, which was considered sacred by Native American peoples, was a place being considered to dump that radioactive waste. And Native American groups were up in arms. They were angry that, again, their native lands were being used as a dumping ground. And so this is the current situation for Native Americans. They have made strides with the revenue from the gaming industry, but because they don't really control their own destiny and they don't have the same political power as other people, they are often being taken advantage of. And sometimes leaders within that community are bribed to go along with the government and make it easy for the government to use reservations as a kind of dumping ground. So we should all take responsibility for that and be educated about what's going on. The next movement that we need to talk about is the Chicano or Latino movement. And this movement is certainly important for us here in California, especially in recent years. But the history of the movement actually goes back to the Mexican-American War in 1848. We understand that the southwest of the United States was basically taken from Mexico during that war because Mexico wasn't strong enough to defend Texas and California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah. And as a result, you have many people in the southwest of the United States who were promised citizenship, but then were never treated as full citizens of the United States. One aspect of this movement needs to be addressed, and this is a globalized business, the threat of globalization that has dominated Latin America throughout its development. And the idea is that the United States has many very powerful companies, and those companies try to find the cheapest products and the cheapest labor they can. And because in the United States there was a high demand for tropical fruit, you had plantations in Hawaii. Again, a colony was set up in Hawaii, and then eventually the business people overthrew the royalty in Hawaii, and it became territory of the United States and eventually a state of the Union. But the history there is that business people wanted to use the resources, and eventually they got control of them. The same is true throughout Latin America, whether it's Mexico or Cuba or South America. And the main company that dominated tropical produce was called the United Fruit Company. And the United Fruit Company would go to these Latin American countries, they would bribe the political officials, and then they would get a monopoly on the fruit. Mainly, we're talking bananas and pineapples and things like that. And so those were all then taken back to the United States and were sold very cheaply because the workers in Latin America were not making very much. The farmers there were being taken advantage of. And so the United Fruit Company became a symbol for Latin America of the domination of the United States in the rest of the world. And that has carried over for people who live in the United States who are from a background that connects them to the Latin American world. And so the UFC, or the United Fruit Company, was kind of the villain of the story. Today, we call them Chiquita Banana Company. Chiquita is a part of that United Fruit Company, and they have changed. They no longer are abusive in the ways that they were in the past, but we need to pay attention to this globalization that is basically making slaves of lesser developed countries in the world. One man who is a symbol of the rights of Latin Americans, of Hispanic Americans, people who live in the United States who are Americans, who are Latinos, and the man who is a symbol is Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was a farm worker, and he, through his perseverance, he was able to create a union. It created a situation where the migrant workers in the southwest of the United States, who were largely Latino, they were being paid dirt cheap wages. And because of Cesar Chavez and his union activity and political activity, those laborers were given rights. Their rights were secured, and they were paid higher wages. What's the legacy of Latino Americans in the United States? Well, we know that there is an incredible richness that they bring to our country because of their culture, because of their traditional values, but it's much, much more than that. They have uh, many needs because many times those who immigrate to the United States, they do not speak English fluently. They are from backgrounds where they may not have as much education, and so learning a new language may be a struggle for them because of their traditional values. They often live in close-knit communities and speak their home language. And their children, because they're immersed in that language, also have difficulties when they go to school. They have a harder time learning English. And so we would say that there are many Latino children who have second language needs. That doesn't mean that they are less. In fact, we need to see that they have second language gifts because they are bilingual. So even if they are maybe struggling in some ways to learn a language in school, they bring something to us that we should all be craving, and we should want to know other languages. And the fact that we have these human bridges, these people who have bilingual skills, that is something that we can't deny. And often those Latino immigrants or children of Latino immigrants who have come into our country, they do the jobs that have built our country, the manual labor jobs, as we said, the farm worker jobs, but it's pervasive, and eventually the children and grandchildren of those Latino immigrants, they become professionals in our society, and they make us a richer American tapestry. Now, recently, because there have been many illegal immigrants into the United States through Mexico, through the border with Mexico, but also through other various points of entry, we have a situation in our country where we have to know how to address the needs of those immigrants, and we have to protect their rights. And some Americans think that they shouldn't have any rights because they are invaders to our country. But the reality is that these are human beings, and that we need to somehow work through this situation without creating more problems. And we need to value the resources that immigrants bring to our country. Because of this situation being so close to so many Latino families, because they have a family member or friends who have been recent immigrants, there is a lot of immigration advocacy within the Latino community. And the basic understanding is, if you know someone who is an immigrant, you will want to help them. And this is a reminder to all of us. We were all immigrants at one point, except for Native Americans, who form 1% of our country. So 99% of our country came from somewhere else at some point in time. And it's important for us to remember that the Latino movement, also called the Chicano movement from the 1960s, they are reminding us of our true American values. During the Vietnam War, many Chicano, Latino people were protesting the Vietnam War. Again, there was a disproportionate representation in Vietnam of Latino soldiers and Black soldiers. And they didn't have the resources to get out of Vietnam and get out of the draft. So this movement, it's all around us, especially here in California, but all over the United States. And we need to recognize that we can come together on this issue, and we will be stronger for that. The next movement in our country is the Asian American movement. And I would say that this movement has lagged behind the other movements to some degree. And that's not the fault of any Asian Americans. It's because in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act made it illegal for Chinese to enter the country. And this also made it very difficult for people in the country who were Chinese Americans already here at that time, were cut off from their families. And so from 1882 forward, there were bans on Chinese immigration, Asian immigration in general. And this actually happened after women had been banned in the 1870s. So it started with women being banned, then all Chinese and Asian immigrants were banned. Gradually, there were some adjustments to this. In the early 1900s, 105 Chinese could enter every year, which is just, it's nothing. And so these were known as quotas. And there were formulas to decide how many of each group could come into our country. And clearly, Chinese were at the bottom of that. It wasn't until the 1950s that things started to change. This is after the Communist Revolution and the fact that many of those who were fleeing communism, they had to go to Taiwan, and then they hoped someday to come to the United States. And so there were adjustments. Immigration increased pretty dramatically at that point in the 1950s, but it wasn't until 1965 when there was an act passed that made it illegal to discriminate, and that was called the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. It got rid of the national origins formula, which had kept certain groups out of the United States. So with the end of Chinese quotas in the mid-1960s, you had a surge in immigration. And what was very clear was that there was a difference in people's minds between the different groups. It seemed that some groups assimilated faster. That means they became the same as the rest of Americans. They learned to speak English faster. There are a lot of reasons for that. And it would be wrong to say that one group is better than another group. And we always need to be very careful of that. So during the Korean War, you had another influx of Korean immigrants as well. And during the Vietnam War, you had Vietnamese immigrants. So you have more than just Chinese immigrants at this point. But there seemed to be a common denominator among these Asian groups, that they seemed to be willing to assimilate in ways that other groups hadn't. And so their children became very successful. They were encouraged to speak English only rather than learning the language of their ancestry, which was very damaging in some families as they were separated from their parents and grandparents because they weren't speaking the same language anymore. But there was a myth that was floating around that Asians were somehow the model minority. This is very condescending. We need to be very careful with this phrase. A minority group, first of all, is smaller than a larger population. And at that time in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, the white population was bigger than other populations. The Black population was the biggest group, and you had the Latino population, and you had a small Asian population within the American population. And so the model minority means that as a smaller group, they are the ones that everybody else should be like. Everyone else should do things the way that Asian Americans are doing them. And even Asian Americans are very uncomfortable with this kind of label. It's a stereotype, and it also puts a certain group of people in a box, saying you are good because you do things this way, but don't go across the line. Don't try and be too much like white Americans, or you will lose your place. And that is the situation that we have in our country today, where there's a lot of racism underneath the surface. One important thing that did happen regarding Asian Americans happened in 1988. It was the Civil Liberties Act. And again, it was signed by President Reagan, and it was to try to acknowledge the great crime that had been committed when Japanese Americans were put in prisons during World War II. They were interned. Interned is a fancy word for being put in prison just because they were Japanese. And the fear, this is under President Roosevelt, but the fear was that somehow they would be spies and that they would help their family members or people from the same people group who were in Japan, who were the enemies of the United States. Another milestone in Asian American history in the United States was the election of Gary Locke to become the governor of Washington. And Gary Locke was Taiwanese, and he grew up appreciating his culture. He was eventually chosen to, in addition to becoming governor, he also was an ambassador to China and the Secretary of Commerce. And so he was very active in government. And he is probably the highest ranking official other than Elaine Chao. Elaine Chao is another Chinese American who has been in the government in various roles and is currently a secretary in President Trump's cabinet. Currently, she is the Secretary of Transportation. So, Asian Americans, it's important to see their achievements, but it's also to recognize that every group is different. They all have strengths that they bring to the American tapestry. Now, I'm purposely not calling it a melting pot because I think it would be wrong to imply that people have to melt to become the same as everyone else. We have to have common ground, but let's honor one another's differences as well. Finally, the last group that I want to talk about is Americans with disabilities. Now, there have always been Americans who have been struggling because they were not given the same abilities as other people in the country. At the same time, they have unique abilities. There were schools for the blind, schools for the deaf, back to the beginning of American history. And so it's clear that people with special needs have often found ways for their own training and they have been given care. But for the most part, those with disabilities have been pushed to the margins. They have not been allowed full participation in American life. And this is because, practically speaking, there hasn't been an effort to make things accessible to them. And so a breakthrough moment came in 1990 with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This opened up access for all people, no matter what their needs might be. And that meant that schools and government buildings and businesses, they were all required to provide access. And that meant elevators and ramps for people with wheelchairs, or it meant providing professionals in the classroom to support children who had special needs. It makes a whole new world for people who hadn't had access up until that point in time. And the key of this ADA was non-discrimination. And this had great impact on schools, as schools were required to provide access to education for everyone, and it didn't matter what their IQ was. It didn't matter what needs they had. In fact, schools were required to hire professionals to accompany those with special needs. For example, sign language speakers, meaning those who could use sign language, were used in the classroom so that those who were deaf, those who were hearing impaired, could have access to the material. The idea behind all this is full inclusion. And this is very controversial because once you decide that a classroom in a public school must include everyone, that means the teacher has to be able to teach all of those students. And so it's a very complicated and even expensive process. But the United States government has now declared that it is important enough that we have full inclusion, that we're going to protect the rights of all disabled people to access education, to access services within the community, whether it's public buses or things like that. Now, disabilities has also expanded to include those who previously had not even been diagnosed as having some sort of disability or special need. This includes things like ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and sometimes that is a very poorly understood concept. There are many students today in our public school system, in our private school system in the United States, who have been diagnosed with ADHD because they have differences and they have different needs. And so the government reminds us, back to that ADA of 1990, the government reminds us that we must find a way to meet the needs of all people. And there has also been an increase of diagnoses of autism and Asperger's. And these conditions are often very subtle. They are things that have not been very well understood in the past. And it's necessary for teachers and all adults and professionals to learn about this so that as a country, we can accommodate the needs of those who have differences. Even the word disability emphasizes something that people can't do, which is not fair. We are differently abled. We are not disabled. And that includes every single one of us. We all have different gifts given to us by God. One very controversial part of this movement has to do with vaccinations. It was suggested that somehow mandated vaccinations from the government was causing autism in our country. Now, this has no scientific basis, but it gained momentum and people started to become afraid of vaccinations. The terrible irony of this is something like polio has been driven out of our country because of the polio vaccine. And before there was a vaccine, those who suffered from polio and survived, they had disabilities. They had needs because of their disease. And so what people are saying today is it's better to not get vaccinations, even if you might have a problem in your life. So we're wrestling with this today. We're wrestling with science. We're wrestling with understanding what the government should tell us to do. And unfortunately, because people who are called anti-vaxxers, people who are against vaccinations, have succeeded in getting people to stop vaccinating their children, there have been increases in cases of the measles and mumps, and these diseases were thought to be completely gone from our country. And the problem is that certain people in our country cannot be vaccinated even if they wanted to be, and so they are vulnerable. And if other people are getting the measles, they can pass the measles on to those vulnerable individuals, and then their rights are violated. So this is a very critical question that we're facing in our era today. I hope that we'll pay attention to all of these movements and realize that we are a part of every single movement, whether we want to be or not, whether we know it or not. And it's our duty to learn about them, even if we are inadequate, like me. I'm very inadequate in explaining these different movements because I haven't been a part of them, but I want to learn, and I hope you do too. Thanks for watching.